Welcome to CHITHEADS from Embodied Philosophy. I'm your host, Jacob Kyle. In each episode of this podcast, I interview a different elder, leader, or teacher from the yoga and wider wisdom community on topics ranging from Eastern philosophy and practices to consciousness studies, social justice, and the human spiritual condition. If you like what you hear, please help us share these teachings with others by leaving us a review on iTunes. And of course, be sure to check out our writings and other educational materials on embodiedphilosophy.com. Thanks so much for listening. Hello, everyone. Before we get into today's interview, I just wanted to announce that this episode's guest is featured in our upcoming free online conference called Radical Practice, Living the Yoga Sutras and Bhagavad Gita. This is a 3-day conference featuring 10 esteemed teachers exploring the teachings of yoga philosophy as found in these two ancient texts. The conference is taking place from April 21st to the 23rd, 2017, and features Yoga Sutras translator and commentator Professor Edwin Bryant, author of Inside the Yoga Sutras, Reverend Yagannath Carrera, Master Iyengar teacher Nikki Costello, meditation teacher Pandit Das, author and commentator Danyudara Swami, author and yoga philosophy teacher Joshua M. Green, founder of the Sanskrit studies method Manorma, popular yoga teacher Raghunath, author and cultural commentator Matthew Remski, and tantric scholar Christopher Tompkins. If you'd like to sign up for the conference, just go to radpractice.embodiedphilosophy.com. That's radpractice, all one word, .embodiedphilosophy.com. And you can also sign up at 5tattvas.com/radical-practice. We're very excited to announce the launch of our newest community offering, Embodied Philosophy Forum, a private Facebook group for members of the Embodied Philosophy community. Those who sign up will receive exclusive access to video recordings of these CHITHEADS podcasts before they are officially published, mini trainings in Eastern philosophy and practices conducted via Facebook Live, conversations facilitated by our group administrators, live Q&A video sessions on topics voted on by members of the group, as well as early access and exclusive discounts on embodied philosophy programs, trainings, and retreats. To join the group, just go to forum.embodiedphilosophy.com, or you can search for Embodied Philosophy Forum in the Facebook search bar. While CHITHEADS is largely a labor of love, a lot of time goes into scheduling, recording, editing, post-production, web pages, and sharing through social media. CHITHEADS thus needs your support and is therefore currently seeking patrons to help us offset the costs associated with the production of this podcast. If you have been inspired by or benefited from these interviews in any way, and you have some disposable income, we'd very much appreciate your support through a monthly contribution. We've recently signed up with Patreon.com, which is an online patronage platform that allows you to make monthly contributions for as little as $1. You can find our page at patreon.com, that's patreon.com/CHITHEADS. If every one of our loyal listeners gave even just $1 per month, we'd be able to make CHITHEADS a regular weekly podcast, which we so want to do. So thank you so much for your consideration, and now let's get into today's interview. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to CHITHEADS. Today's guest is Edwin Bryant. Edwin Bryant received his Ph.D. in Indic languages and cultures from Columbia University. He taught Hinduism at Harvard University for 3 years and is presently the professor of Hinduism at Rutgers University, where he teaches courses on Hindu philosophy and religion. He has received numerous awards and fellowships, published 6 books, and authored a number of articles on Vedic history, yoga, and the Krishna tradition. In addition to his academic work for the scholarly community, Edwin's Penguin World Classics translation of the Srimad Bhagavata Purana, the traditional source for the story of Krishna's incarnation, is both for Indology specialists as well as students and those interested in Hinduism from the general reading public and the yoga community. As a personal practitioner of yoga for 35 years, a number of them spent in India studying with traditional teachers where he returns yearly, Edwin strives to combine academic scholarship and rigor with sensitivity towards traditional knowledge systems. In addition to his academic course load, Edwin currently teaches workshops on the Yoga Sutras, Bhagavad Gita, and Hindu philosophy at yoga studios and teacher training courses throughout the country. His translation of and commentary on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is specifically dedicated to contributing to the growing body of literature on yoga by providing insights from the major pre-modern commentaries on the text with a view to grounding the teachings in their traditional context. So with that, hello, Edwin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning.
So before we get started and dive deep into the incredible work that you've done on yoga philosophy and the scholarship that you've written, I'd love to hear a little bit about your personal story and what kind of led you to this deep work that you've dedicated yourself to on the yoga tradition and the texts of the tradition.
Well, I was sort of fascinated with India from a very young age. And I was one of those characters that hitchhiked to India back in the 70s when you could still do that, overland, and spent a number of years in India at that time, which were very formative years. And I lived in an ashram also for a number of years. And eventually I became a little disillusioned with ashram life and was looking for another way to continue my studies, deepen my studies, and academia presented itself as an option. So I happened to be in New York City at the time. So somehow or other I ended up in Columbia University, and I got my Ph.D. in Sanskrit. And then just doors opened, and in certain ways, and I ended up teaching. So that I find myself now as a professor of Hinduism at Rutgers.
Can you explain a little bit why you became disillusioned with ashram life?
Well, I think a fairly standard experience. I mean, ashrams are ultimately institutions, and institutions are useful in many ways, but they're also hierarchical, and institutions require resources and manpower, and that can breed politics and greed and all of the human failings. So those sorts of reasons, I think, are fairly common with people who've had experiences in institutionalized kind of spiritual settings. Mm-hmm.
And what challenges, this is actually a good way of moving into the next question, because you mentioned institution, and you moved from the institution of ashram life to the institution of academia. And I'm curious because you're not just a scholar, but you're also a practitioner. And so I'm curious about what kind of challenges you've confronted juggling this, I don't know if it's correct to say, like a dual identity between being both an academic and a practitioner, especially since it seems that the culture of Western academia is not necessarily so friendly to yogic practices or spiritual practices of any sort generally. So I'm curious about kind of how that experience has panned out in your own life.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. There was a lot of dissonance when I came back from India, after spending years in India in very traditional contexts. And of course, when you're studying in those sorts of contexts, the texts are sacred texts. They're considered to be revelations of sorts, whether they're coming from sages or rishis or Ishvara or whatever the genealogy of the text might present itself as being. They're considered to be sort of sacred sources. And of course, academe is not about subjective, confessional, experiential relationship with the subject matter, but objectivity. So the text is just an artifact like any other artifact. There's nothing supernatural or sacred about it. It's considered to be a human product, just like, cuneiform script or hieroglyphics on the pyramid wall. And they're looked at, through those sorts of lenses. And academia if I were to generalize, tends to be much more concerned with the context, because the texts are considered to be human products. Then academia tends to be very concerned with, what was the context in which the text was? What was the ideology informing the text? What's the human context, the cultural context, the political context, the ideological context that informs the text? So they're not looking at the text as a source of spiritual, experiential knowledge, but as a human artifact. So that's a very different approach, and it did take me a while to adjust to that. I don't think one ever really, at least I never really adjusted fully, but what you learn to do is wear different hats in different contexts.
Right, right.
I like to think of it as dharma. People have multiple dharmas. We have parent dharmas, we have children dharmas, we have friend dharmas, we have sibling dharmas, and we adjust ourselves according to those dharmas. We're not the same person in every context. Life demands of us. So likewise with academe. So when I'm in an academic setting, I would wear an academic hat, use a certain type of terminology and vocabulary, and draw on sort of theoretical models that are appropriate to that context. And when I'm, say, lecturing in a yoga studio and reading the text with practitioners, I'll wear a very different sort of hat. And I'll put on a dhoti. When I go to a workshop in a yoga studio, I'll always bring my dhoti. And that's sort of a symbolic kind of gesture of making a transition from a certain way of looking at the text to a traditional way of looking at the text, which is the hat I wear when I'm with fellow practitioners in yoga studios.
Now, you say that when you're a scholar versus when you come into a yoga studio, you're wearing a different hat. But is there any way in which, or any ways that you could extrapolate on, that you feel like the scholarly and the devotional have complemented one another?
Well, in some ways, yes, because the academic has really taught me to be rigorous and objective and honest. And I think in the traditions in India tend to be very sectarian, sect-specific. So you tend to sort of end up in a sectarian lineage with a sort of a guru and a set of practices and a metaphysics and a theology, whether it's Kashmir Shaivism, whether it's Gaudiya Vaishnavism, whether it's Advaita Vedanta, and likewise with Buddhism. And so you end up tending to filter everything through that particular lens. So academe tends, of course, it trains one to do the opposite, to try to bracket one's lenses. Of course, it's impossible to do that, but at least in principle, one makes an effort to bracket one's subjective lens and look at something objectively. And I think that's been very useful, and I very much appreciate that. I mean, even though I still remain connected to a traditional lineage, I'm much more able to critique the lineage, if you will, because that's what you do in academia. You critique, not in a negative sense, but you're not accepting something as a priori true just because it's written in Sanskrit. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there are ways where I think there is a nice, where academia complements or enhances, a relationship with the tradition. But there's other ways where there are obviously complete and utter dissonances. When we think of sacred time, notions of time or history or cosmography, obviously these are very different. The way that modern science construes these things, human history, the cosmos and so forth, and the way the sacred traditions visualize these things are very different, and those are incompatible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate kind of what the spirit of what you represent, being a scholar practitioner, and I've tried to interview other similar scholar practitioners for this podcast, and one of the things a symptom that I notice that I hope eventually that people like you will help to kind of dissolve is something that I encountered the other day on a Facebook conversation where I was sharing some of the findings of a particular scholar on topics related to the medieval tantric texts. And there was a person who responded quite aggressively, asking what this scholar's guru was, and saying that he wouldn't even listen or even approach what he had looked at, or even tarry with what he had seen that I had offered without first knowing who his guru was and his guru's guru. So there was this kind of, blind faith in a certain devotional tradition. And then on the other side, you see the same thing. You see sometimes in scholarship, the guru is completely written off as being, just hocus pocus nonsense. So there's this kind of mutual denial of one another. Whereas I see, you really representing something that bypasses that or transcends that.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you just said. You can be sort of fanatical, if you will, or confined to a certain lens or a way of looking at things. And the tradition in India, there are lineages, there are sampradayas, there are paramparas, and you have a guru, and then in fact that's sometimes the first thing you know, in a traditional context, one of the first questions that might be asked of you is, who is your guru? And when you respond to that, of course, the person will know exactly from your guru what your lineage is, what your presuppositions are, what your theological universe is, and so forth, what your practices are. But I think it's a bit unfortunate, and that's fine, but I think it's a bit unfortunate then completely denying the authority or jurisdiction of other ways of looking at the same. I think scholars have lots of insight. They provide very interesting information about the development of texts, about the history surrounding the production of texts. I think that can be very useful. And I think it's unfortunate on both sides. You see it on both sides. You see, certainly in academia, people with complete disdain.
Right.
Anybody that, in fact, there are many practitioner scholars who are sort of in the closet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That are you know, very careful about revealing their let's say their personal relationship with the material, because for fear of being branded or labeled as, you know, confessional, subjective, sectarian, or even worse, you know, right wing Hindu.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you encountered any of that disdain personally directed at you in your own life?
Well, I've never shared my. Everybody knows.
Yeah.
But I've never actually come out and stated it, or sort of. I mean, I guess on my website you just read as a personal practitioner of yoga, but I keep it very vague.
Right.
So I don't share that because I don't find it particularly useful to be sort of pigeonholed into a box.
Sure, of course.
So everybody knows, but it doesn't inform my scholarship, and I let my scholarship speak for itself.
Yeah, yeah.
And I, you know, some scholars take different, practitioners take different positions. There's this thing called postmodern disclosure, where some scholars will say, look, you know, let's forget this silly facade of being objective. No one is objective. It's impossible to be objective. So let's disclose right at the beginning of one's discourse. It's called postmodern disclosure. Postmodern meaning, you know, modernity had this sort of myth of objectivity, the objective world out there that we could analyze from an objective vantage point and sort of understand and conquer and dominate. Well, postmodernism, of course, deconstructs that and says that's all a myth. There is no such thing as objectivity, blah, 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 blah. So there's this thing called postmodern disclosure, where sort of one position some academics take is, let's just be upfront and say, you know, lay it on the table. And then, of course, we're duty bound. Our dharma as academics is to be objective. But let's at least lay out what our, you know, recognize the myth of that and lay out what our filters are, so there's out there. You know, I never found that particularly useful. I mean, I respect that, I admire that, and there are some of my colleagues are out and out, you know, members of the Ramakrishna mission or Kashmir Shaivites or Gaudiya Vaishnavas, but I didn't find that particularly useful or necessary. I mean, we don't ask scholars what their sexual orientations are. We don't ask those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
So why should we ask them what their religious or spiritual affiliations are?
Yeah.
And if anybody directly and bluntly asks me, I'll respond.
Right.
I'm not going to not disclose that. I mean, I have nothing to hide. Mm-hmm. But I don't go out, I don't sort of publish that, except in rather vague terms. I'll say something like, I've been a practitioner of yoga, but of course that could mean anything. That could be touching your toes for 35 years.
Right, exactly, yeah. Well, and moving toward a work that you did a number of years ago now that I can remember seeing in one of the first yoga studios I ever went to frequently, and a few years before I actually purchased it and read it, but when I did, I was really blown away, which is your translation of the Yoga Sutras. So I'm interested in hearing about your work on that, and specifically perhaps maybe noting or discussing a few aspects of your translation that you feel like are a departure from perhaps what was up until then maybe the colloquial understanding within yoga studios about certain translations of the Yoga Sutras, or maybe differences of translation compared to other interpretations or translations, if you want to note any of that.
Well, what I found was that what became clear to me was that we have, you know, very scholarly translations of the Yoga Sutras with the commentaries. By the way, we can't understand the sutras without a commentary.
Right.
Impossible to understand. We need to have. So in the tradition, anybody studying the Yoga Sutras, traditionally the last 2,000 years or 1,500 years would be reading the Patanjali along with the commentary of Vyas. So there were literal and very well undertaken translations of the commentaries, but those are inaccessible to anyone that doesn't have a fairly sophisticated grasp of Indian philosophy and the Indian intellectual world. So there was, on the one hand, there were those, and on the other hand, there were sort of these modern translations that had taken massive liberties, that were not representing the tradition, that had taken yoga in very, very different ways, in directions. And so I felt there was a need for a commentary that was grounded in the tradition, that was faithful to the tradition, representing the insights of the traditional commentators, especially Vyas, but rather than just a literal translation, which would then be inaccessible, but taking extracts from that and articulating in a way that would be accessible to an educated non-specialist.
Yes.
Either practitioner or not practitioner. I mean, there's certainly for the practitioner community, it was definitely I had that community in mind, but also just intellectual citizens of the world that were interested in the Yoga Sutras. So that was the motive for the commentary. And I'm doing the same thing now for the Bhagavad Gita.
Oh, excellent.
And and that was, and then so that was my vision.
That was the spirit of the project. Great. Yeah. When is the Bhagavad Gita translation being released?
I just finished a book called Bhakti Yoga with the same publisher. It's actually a trilogy. I had a trilogy in mind.
Oh, excellent.
Really, it's sort of the Bhakti Yoga is I guess it's the grand finale, or where I see it all as culminating.
Yes.
And the Gita is really a link between the Yoga Sutras and Bhakti Yoga.
Yes, and I want to talk about that too in a few moments. I have a few questions about that, but before we get into Bhakti and the Bhagavad Gita, I wanted to ask you in the Yoga Sutras you mention that you rightly point out that the yoga, which is often understood, people talk about it yoking, and it's often mistranslated according to your translation of yoking the body and mind, or yoking. And you actually point out that it is rather the yoga is a process of unyoking Purusha from Prakriti. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that and discuss why this is quite different from what perhaps is being propagated as yoga.
Well, there's a lot of talk now in sort of alternative spiritual circles of sort of harmonizing and body, mind, and soul and so forth. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. But that's just not what yoga is. At least not what the Yoga Sutras are. Yeah. And the project of the Yoga Sutras is a radical dualism. It's right in the second verse. Yoga is chitta vritti nirodha, and what happens? Drashtu sarupe vastanam. The seer abides in its own autonomous nature. The word for liberation that Patanjali uses is kevalya, which is autonomy, separateness, disjunction. So, if you look at the 8 limbs of yoga, pratyahara is to withdraw consciousness from the external. And so forth. So the goal of yoga is to remove consciousness. It's not to create a harmony. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And maybe in terms of the lifestyle of yoga, that's fine. Having the sort of harmony between body, healthy mind, all of that. That's all fine. But that's not the grand finale goal of yoga. The grand finale goal of yoga, Nirbija Samadhi, is for consciousness to withdraw from all of that, to involute, and to really sort of discover its own pure nature. So that's basic 101 yoga philosophy.
Yeah. So given that it's become the seminal text, rightly or not, of the yoga tradition or the contemporary Western yoga tradition. How did that happen in your view? And do you think it's problematic that it's become the main text of a modern practice that talks more about, or is more interested in yoking body to mind and harmonizing, as you say, the body and the mind, when in fact it's philosophically directing one toward quite a different experience?
I used to think it was problematic, and I guess I was a bit of an intellectual snob and kind of stuck my nose up and thought that, the sort of only the select few understood the real teachings of yoga. But then I realized how foolish that was, and that was just my ego. And now I don't feel like that. I feel that that even though a lot of the commentaries, modern commentaries or presentations of yoga are not representing the tradition, but nonetheless, the Yoga Sutras have become canonical for that community, because of Guruji Iyengar and various other teachers, and that have focused on the sutras. And by the way, there's a historical reason for that. Mm-hmm. We discuss as well. Why does this text, which no one in India ever reads at all? There's more people reading the Yoga Sutras in the States than in India. So why is a text that practically become defunct in India, when the British were in India, they couldn't find a living teacher of the Yoga Sutras anywhere? So why does a text that had, to all intents and purposes, become a sort of extinct tradition, mm-hmm. how does that all of a sudden become the Bible or the canonical text of the yoga community? That's a story which is very interesting.
Yes.
But that's a story for another day. But now I think, to answer your question, I'm what I find, and I do a lot of workshops with asana-based, body-mind, holistic kind of attitudes toward yoga. I find more and more people are realizing, it's more awareness. I mean, these gurus came 50 years ago, and so people are reading more, and there's more awareness. There's a lot more to yoga than asana and just body-mind holism. And so I'm finding there's an increasing openness and curiosity about the sutras, and the fact that we have the sutras, they've become fossilized now. That's what a sutra is. There are various sutra traditions in ancient India, and they were meant precisely to preserve technical information so that they would survive the ravages of time and place and context. So we have these sutras. And what that means is then there's going to be people like me who are going to go around, and call us Puritans or whatever you want, who are going to say, well, this is really what it means. Mm-hmm. And if even only 5% of the yoga community show interest to that, that's still a huge body of people. Mm-hmm. And I'm finding that number of people who are actually becoming more interested in what the traditional commentaries on the sutras have to say, I'm finding that's growing enormously.
So then how does someone because for me personally, I actually was totally moved by your text and was ready to kind of write it off. So how does someone like me, who is a modern practitioner, who does see this kind of radical dualism embedded in the text, how is someone like myself able to still gain benefit from the text without feeling like, it's not an aspect of what I'm practicing, or it doesn't make sense to integrate with my practice? Should I be seeking other texts, or should I be, is there a way to be open to a text even while you know the original intent?
Well, I like to think of it this way, and I always say this. I think the Yoga Sutras is what most of us are in the world, and we are working in the world. So I think in terms of yoga in life, as opposed to the forest, I see the Yoga Sutras as a forest text. It's coming out of the Upanishadic tradition, Upanishads, which are forest books. Mm-hmm. I think it's the Bhagavad Gita really tells us how to live in the world.
Yes.
Perform our duties, have families if we have families and so forth. So I think of it this way. I think the Yoga Sutras is what we do from 5 in the morning till 6:30, our meditative practice. And I think to really kind of, I think, legitimately kind of, this is just me, but legitimately kind of consider oneself a yogi or a spiritual practitioner, I think one has to have some kind of a meditative practice that one does in the morning before the day starts. Seems to me that's kind of like the minimum. So Patanjali, helps us there, and that meditative practice involves harnessing the mind, focusing it on our mantras or whatever our objective meditation is. So I think of the yoga, at least in my life, the Yoga Sutra informs what I do from 5 till, let's say, 6:30 or 7, and the Bhagavad Gita then informs what I do 9 to 5, so to speak, meaning the rest of the day. My life in the world and interacting with others, and how to fix the mind on Ishvara, and how to try to renounce attachment to the fruits of one's work, and all of those sort of basic teachings of the Gita. So I do think the Yoga Sutras has a place for anyone that likes to think that they have a meditation practice, at least in the Hindu tradition. We're not talking about mindfulness. In the Buddhist tradition, that's a very different type of practice.
Okay, that's really interesting. I really like what you said, because I feel like it echoes actually a little bit what you said about wearing hats, and it almost like what I hear you saying is that there are different hats that we can wear in our practice, and you know, at a certain time of the day, I'm wearing the hat of the Yoga Sutras, and at that in that particular section of time in my life, I am operating within the metaphysics of the sutras, and then I move on to an alternative metaphysics. I kind of like this idea of being moved into different metaphysics throughout the day.
Yes. Could I just say that I wouldn't necessarily think of it so much as metaphysics as mental cultivations. The metaphysical universe remains the same.
Right.
The Prakriti, Purusha, Ishvara kind of, that's metaphysics. Like the ultimate ingredients of reality remain the same, but it's more a mental cultivation.
Yes.
What we do with the mind. So what we do with the mind is different when we're practicing Patanjali in yoga, and what we do with the mind then is different when we're practicing the Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga of the Gita.
Yes. Okay. So now I want to ask you about Ishvara, which you mentioned, and my question about this actually comes from, I was inspired by several discussions / arguments that I've had with people, and Ishvara, in your work, you and correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a while since I read it, but I believe that you make the argument that it's a theistic conception based on the history and the context. But there's a lot of translations of the Yoga Sutras that I've found that are very hesitant to describe the Ishvara function as theistic, and I've seen words like archetypes, archetypal yogi, stuff like this, and I'm wondering if that hesitation comes from a desire or an agenda to see the Yoga Sutras as non-theistic, or to see them as, as basically being capable of being adopted by someone who doesn't believe in God.
I think you've just hit it right on the head there.
Perfect.
Anyone that knows the history of the word Ishvara in the 3rd century has to accept that the term primarily means it's God with a big G. It means Vishnu, and it means Krishna. That's Ishvara. Right, more specific, that's actually what it means. It's not just God in some sort of vague, abstract way, but it specifically would, Patanjali was in all likelihood, a Vaishnava, a Shaivite, or a Krishnite. And I think there's resistance, not just this resistance to accepting the word Ishvara, as what it actually means, and what to speak of. Taking the next step, which is, that concept in India at that time meant Vishnu, Shiva, and even more resistance to that. That doesn't even enter the conversation. And I think it's basically a sort of, I think there's a reaction against the Abrahamic notion of God.
Yes.
Many people are sort of going to the Eastern traditions to flee away from that Abrahamic notion, or they've had some bad experience, whatever it might have been, in their Sunday school or Catholic priests or rabbis or whatever it might be, and they all somehow been dissatisfied with with Western theism. Should we just leave it sort of vague like that, and have turned east, in the hope of ditching that sort of big man in the sky notion, and therefore when they find the term Ishvara in the Yoga Sutras, then try to sort of wriggle out of it, wriggle their way around it or out of it, and try to sort of come up with these silly ideas of, archetypal yogi, which has got nothing to do with Indian philosophy at all. So, I wrote a paper on this, and I would have published it, but someone now in the University of Boulder, Colorado, just did his MA thesis, basically, looking at this in a much more rigorous way than I did in my paper, and really establishing without any doubt that the term Ishvara in the textual tradition at the time of Patanjali could only mean, and does only mean, in the Moksha Dharma, the text that immediately before the sutras, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, so these sort of primary pan-Indian texts, the term Ishvara means God with a capital G.
Okay.
I'm encouraging him to publish, instead of publishing that in some scholarly journal, which mostly academics will read, to actually publish that as a book. So we'll have I think, a very authoritative source to turn to make that argument, I think, without, clearly and incontestably.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Do you mind giving the name of that academic?
Yeah, you might get to interview him. His name is Jonathan Dickenstein, I think, and he is if you do a web search, University of Boulder, Colorado, you can mention my name and Jonathan Dickenstein. He's just defended his MA, and I think he's still there. I think he still has that. I think he has to submit it. I mean, he's defended it successfully, and he's now applying for PhD programs. So, interview him. And
all right, excellent. Yeah,
it'd be a good addition for your.
Great. Yeah, I'll look him up. So now I want to ask you. I want to actually ask you about the Yoga Sutras alongside the Bhagavad Gita, which you've kind of been mentioning a little bit. And I know you said that the metaphysics doesn't change, but in my own understanding, and maybe you disagree with this, in my understanding, there is a kind of metaphysical difference between what is propagated in the Yoga Sutras and what is in the Bhagavad Gita. So I guess first I want to know, do you agree with that? And then also what the difference of metaphysics is between the two texts.
What do you feel is the difference?
Well, I feel like there's a radical dualism, as you've mentioned about the Yoga Sutras, and then in the Bhagavad Gita there's a certain kind of personified monism.
Well, personified monism. Well, the thing about the Gita is it's part of the Vedanta tradition. And what that means is that the Vedanta tradition has three sources of textual authority, or three texts in its canon: the Upanishads, which is really what it is rooted in, and then the Vedanta Sutras, which were written to clarify the Upanishads, and then the Bhagavad Gita. These are the three texts. They're called the Prasthana Traya. And the characteristic of the Vedanta tradition is that the Vedanta Sutras is incomprehensible, like the Yoga Sutras, and therefore commentaries were written on it. But the difference between the Vedanta tradition and the Yoga Sutra tradition is that in the Vedanta tradition, the commentaries radically differ from each other in basic metaphysical issues, such as what's the relationship between Brahman and Atman, what's the relationship between Brahman and Ishvara, and is the world real or is it false? Is it monistic or is it monotheistic, to use the terms that you just referred to? Mm-hmm. So in Vedanta, we have major differences of opinion on these basic metaphysical issues. You don't have that in the yoga tradition. It's a clear-cut dualism. There's property and purusha. So I would, in my opinion, and of course others would disagree with this, the Bhagavad Gita, the difference, if there is one metaphysically, because obviously you have a Purusha property model in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna is very clear. He discusses property, and he says, Binna prakriti ashtadhar, and in Maya prakriti, that is my property, but basically the same property is there with the earth, water, fire, air, mind, intelligence, and so forth. So it's basically a Sankhya text. We call that Sankhya metaphysics.
Right.
So the Sankhya metaphysics is shared between the two texts. Mm-hmm. But what's significantly different in the Gita is you have a much more robust theism. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't necessarily call it. It depends what we mean by personified monism. I mean, we do have to define these terms. It's monistic in the sense that Krishna claims that everything emanates from him, both the lower nature and the higher nature, both the Purusha, the higher Brahman, and the higher property and the lower property, both the Atman and the property emanate from him, and he's the source of everything and the cause of everything. Now, and he's also Ishvara. So several times in the text, I am that Ishvara, I am Ishvara, I am that Father, I am the source of everything. Now, the Ishvara element in Patanjali is a much more slender one. I call it, sort of theism light, L-I-T-E. Mm-hmm. So we know that Ishvara in Patanjali is a special kind of Purusha. He's an individual, but he's a Purusha Vishesha. We know that he's not subject to time, so he's transcendent. We know that he's a guru and he teaches the ancients, which of course Krishna. Everything that Patanjali says about Ishvara, by the way, is echoed in the Gita, and it's also echoed in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, which is sacred to Shiva. So, but we don't know from Patanjali what's the relationship between Ishvara and the, for example, liberated Atman. Mm-hmm. So certain questions he doesn't go. He tells us what his project is in the second verse, Hatha Yoga Anushasanam. It's not a text about bhakti. It's not a text about Ishvara. It's a text about yoga, and yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. He defines it, and then he goes on. He keeps his eye. Remember, there's only 1,200 words in the sutras. It's a tiny text. Mm-hmm. So there are many questions that remain unanswered in Patanjali, such as what is the relationship between Ishvara and creation, for example? What's the relationship between Ishvara and Prakriti? What's the relationship between Ishvara and the liberated Atman? And so on. Now, those questions are taken up by the Vedanta tradition. That's what they discuss, you know. But the problem, I don't know if it's a problem, but the characteristic of Vedanta is that the different sects, the Advaita Vedanta and Vishishta Advaita Vedanta and Dvaita Advaita and all these different traditions which haven't really been, many of them haven't been transplanted to the West. We have this kind of like neo-Advaita that's very prominent in the West. But that's certainly not, doesn't represent the variety of the old lineages in India. So they'll take very different positions on what is the relationship. So you know, is it a monotheistic text? Is it a monistic text? Who's Krishna? Is Krishna, is Krishna the supreme Godhead? Is Krishna an incarnation of Vishnu? Is Krishna a superimposition on something higher? The different Vedanta lineages are going to take very different views on that. From my reading, there's nothing incompatible at all between, I would say it's the same metaphysics, it's the same Ishvara, Purusha, Prakriti model. The difference is that in the Gita, Krishna comes forward very, very sort of in your face, so to speak, very sort of forcefully, and says, I am that Ishvara. I am the source of everything. Everything hangs on me like pearls on a thread. Aham sarvasya prabhu. I am the Lord of everything. You know, Devi hi yasha maya. You know, this is my maya. This is my Prakriti. These Atmans are my Ankshas. Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. So it's a much more robust, I would consider it to be a monotheistic text.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I'm reminded of is in your introduction to the Bhagavata Purana, you mentioned that Krishna is Brahman, and
Krishna says that in the Gita as well, by the way. Brahmano hi pratishtaham. I am the pratishta. I am the foundation of Brahman.
So then I'm just curious then, how are we to understand, because we've got Brahman, which is discussed as being an impersonal, creative, non-moving source. And then we have Krishna, which is a very kind of active personification of Godhead. How do we reconcile those two?
Well, I just like to say though, but this is where language, we have to be very conscious of the sort of philosophical implications of language, because if we use the word personification, embedded in that word is the idea that personhood is not natural, but it's a personification. It's something imposed on something else.
Ah, I see.
And that's not what the monotheistic traditions would say. The Vaishnava and some Shaivite traditions, they wouldn't say that Shiva or Vishnu or Krishna are personifications, a la Joseph Campbell. They would say rather that the personal aspect of God is the supreme, ultimate, final, causal, absolute stop sign aspect of God. It's not a personification of something else, but personhood is the ultimate, highest, absolute truth. Mm-hmm. But in terms of your logic question, the roots of the problem go back to the Upanishads. Remember, this is Vedanta. Vedanta is coming out of the Upanishads. And the thing about the Upanishads is they say different things in different places. So you have some places where Brahman is described as in personal terms, as you put it, the creative force that underlies everything, the source of the Atman, etc., the foundation of everything. But you have other verses in the Upanishad that speak of Brahman as a thinking, feeling, willing entity that creates in a more sort of monotheistic type of tone.
Yeah.
Now, since the Upanishads are considered Shruti, which means they are a type of text that are considered divine revelation, they're absolute, they are the highest authoritative sacred texts of the Shruti, the Vedas and the Upanishads. And so therefore, and to be a traditional Hindu, that's sort of what it means. To be a traditional Hindu means to accept the sanctity and the revelatory nature of the Vedas. So you're stuck with these, or you have these texts, and the problem is they seem to be saying different things in different places, and that's why the Vedanta Sutras are originally written. They're supposed to clarify that and make them consistent, because if they're divine revelation, they can't be inconsistent. Yeah. Nobody wants to think of divine scriptures being inconsistent. You want to think, well, It's consistent, we're just not reading it properly. So along comes Badarayana, writes the Vedanta Sutras to clarify everything. But the problem with the Vedanta Sutras are they're like some of the Patanjali Sutras. They're so cryptic, we don't have a clue what they mean. There's sutras that have no verb, no subject, just and this, that. Very, very cryptic, 3 or 4 words. And that's why then we have a third layer of exegesis, which are the commentaries on the Vedanta. And those commentaries on the Vedanta then are totally consistent, they're totally comprehensible, they're clear, but they introduce a whole new problem, right? We've got 3 layers of problem. Let's just back up. Let's keep our eye on the ball. The problem with the Upanishads is they say different things in different places. Problem with the Vedanta Sutra is they're incomprehensible. The problem with the commentaries is that they avoid those 2 problems, but they disagree massively amongst themselves. Meaning one lineage from another lineage. So now, to study Vedanta, to get an answer to these kinds of questions that you're raising, well, what is the relationship between Ishvara and Brahman? Is Brahman higher than Ishvara, or is Ishvara higher than Brahman? Is the personhood ultimate, or is impersonality ultimate? Those kinds of questions, then, we then have to turn to the commentaries. And when we turn to the commentaries, we're in the sectarian universe of the Indian lineages. And so we have Advaita Vedanta, which will present one point of view. Then we have the Iyengar, Krishnamacharya, the theistic, Vaishnava commentarial traditions. And they'll give a very, very different presentation of what are the ultimate ingredients of reality. And so then at that point, one has to make a choice. If one wants to sort of enter into a traditional lineage, one has to choose a lineage. To get answers to these sorts of questions.
Well, would you say perhaps that the only way really to reconcile these apparent oppositions is through the experience arrived at in practice? That really, we can talk, there will embedded in the very process of discourse is going to be, we're going to encounter dualisms that can't be transcended until we actually enter the practice themselves, or try to live out these teachings in a way that's going to give us a glimpse of something beyond these words that we're using to describe the ultimate.
Yes, well, just 2 things, if I may. And one is, again, if we say transcending dualism, we're assuming that dualism is a negative thing.
Yeah.
And that's a very neo-Advaita kind of discourse. And I just want to point out that there are venerable and extremely sophisticated experiential spiritual traditions that promote some sort of dualism. Do not espouse this kind of New Agey, perennialist idea that somehow everything is one. Why should it be so? Why cannot there be differentiations within the ultimate truth? Why do we assume that? Our assumption seems to go something like this. This world is a world of imperfection and and therefore the truth that lies beyond it must be beyond all of these world of imperfections and dualisms, and therefore somehow the absolute must be non-dual, and everybody must be somehow tapping in when they get experientially. When meditators go into their mystical states, they must be tapping into the same kind of absolute truth, and then when they come out of that, they reconnect to their mind and senses and their languages and their cultural systems, and it comes out differently, and they articulate it differently because of the clumsiness of language and the imposition of thought. But actually, beyond that, the experience they're really tapping into is the same. Okay, that's what we might call a perennialist position or a monist position. But why? What if we were to challenge that? And what if we were to say, what if the absolute truth itself is, like the Jains would say, like a multifaceted diamond itself? Why should we just imagine this homogeneous, one-size-fits-all, transcendent entity or experience? What if there are both personal and impersonal absolute experiences? And what if some lineages are going to take you and to an impersonal kind of transcendent experience where one is absorbed in pure consciousness, the Satchidananda, the eternity, blissful, pure state of consciousness? But what if other traditions take you, they might say beyond that, but let's avoid the language of hierarchy because then that becomes sectarian.
Yeah.
But let's say, what if other traditions take you to a place of interaction with the divine, playful, personal being? And what if they're all true? instead of trying to force them into this monistic mold and sort of say, well, underneath all the clutter of language and underneath all the clutter of mythology, which is a very kind of New Agey, Aldous Huxley, perennialist, Joseph Campbell sort of thing to do. But underneath all of that, there is this one constant experience. Why should it be so? Why can't, underneath all of that, that's fair enough, let's go beyond the clutter of language and mind and conceptualization and intellectuality, but why can't the transcendent realm itself be variegated and contain eternal, real, both personal and impersonal, just to use two possibilities, experiences? If we allow that, then we allow the traditions, we can allow the truth claims of the traditions on their own terms, instead of trying to force them through our, kind of politically correct, New Agey, it's all one, let's all be happy.
Right, so you're challenging, this is putting it in a simple way, but it seems like you're challenging the kind of old adage that many paths, one truth.
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm just saying, let us at least be open to the possibility that truth itself
is multiple.
Not truth as filtered through our conceptual apparatus, but the truth itself in its own right, in its own standing, in its own essence. That truth itself could be multifaceted. It could have personal and impersonal. There could be a personal God as well as an impersonal experience of one's own inner self. And one doesn't have to deny the other. They can both be true. And therefore, we need to pay attention to the path. Instead of making other paths, somehow interpreting them from the lens of our path, maybe consider that all the truth claims of all of these paths, or at least most of them, are true in their own terms. And if we accept that they are true in their own terms, we're going to have to accept that there is a Vishnu out there, and a Krishna out there, and a goddess out there, and Spanda Shakti, and there is also the Satchidananda Atman, and all of these different things, and maybe they are all true and real. And these different paths do lead to where they claim to be leading, not where we want them to lead in some kind of monistic oneness, just because it's convenient and helps us sort of bring everything into harmony. But they lead where they claim to be leading. And I think if we do that, we're respecting the traditions, and we avoid all the argumentation, not by filtering it through some kind of a monistic lens, but just allow the traditions to all be true by accepting an absolute that is variegated.
Wow, it's an exciting possibility, because it sounds like it would put an end to a lot of unnecessary arguments.
I think so. And I sympathize with the kind of, if I can use the term perennialist. The perennialist position is that, underneath all the clutter of religion, in other words, it tries to be sympathetic. It's not reductionistic. In the study of religion, reductionists are those like Freud and Marx, who say there is no spiritual essence to religion. It's all man-made. And therefore, why is it man-made? And Marx would say, well, because those who want to control the modes of production, they want to, make up stuff to control people. And Freud would say, oh, well, it's really just your deep subconscious, project, whatever they might. But they're reducing it to some human, understandable thing. Mm-hmm. The perennialists are not doing that. They're trying to be sympathetic to religion. They want to accept that there is something that is supernatural or non-reducible, that it has its own essence, that it's something, But then, in order to do that, many perennialists, many theosophists, and there's so many different shades of perennialism. New Advaita is another one. Try to say, well, there is something there, but it's beyond all this sort of theologies and the metaphysics and all of the dogmas and the stories and the hagiographies and the mythologies, and we have to dig through all of that. So in a sense, they're also straitjacketing. They're also sort of imposing an agenda, if you will, on the traditions. But if we, allow the traditions to tell their own story and make their own truth claims, and leave open the possibility that they all are tapping into something, and then the question is, well, how do you account for the fact that their goals are all different? They're promoting different understandings of the absolute. Well, what if we say that the absolute, has all of these aspects and facets? And then many of the traditions are tapping into one of those or some of those. I think to do that, to take a view like that, we are violating these traditions less. Mm-hmm. It's violation and imposition on a tradition.
But how do we respond to the truth claims about that are contingent to particular traditions? I'm thinking of certain interpretations of Christianity that are tending to breed, at least in this contemporary moment, forms of hate that we would perhaps not wish to see. How can we still respect the variegated nature of the absolute while still responding effectively to forces that would perhaps want to smite out, particular peoples or particular minorities?
Sure, I think it's a really, really good question. In a sense, that just sort of goes against everything I just said. But and that's fair enough. I think that's fair enough. I think what I was mostly speaking about was like the ultimate ontological goals of the God, soul, those big questions. But then coming down to human culture and interaction with others, and then at that point, I think we have to make choices, and clearly we do make choices, and we oppose certain things that are done in the name of religion. Yes, at that point, human judgment comes into it. Yeah. So it's not, it's that there are so many shades of gray. I'm not trying to suggest any kind of simplistic black and white model. What I was saying before was more, if we can be open to like the ultimate truth claims of the tradition. But when it comes to issues like, is there a God? Is Vishnu God? Is Christ the Son of God? Is there an Atman which can be infinite and omnipresent? And is there an experience of infinity and so forth? Those ultimate, like the final stop sign of the religions, like what's the highest ultimate truth? I think if we accept those, or leave the door open that more than one of those can be true simultaneously. I think that's where I was going.
Yes, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I want to ask you about a little bit about the Bhagavata Purana, which was one of your works, your translations, the 10th book, because I wanted to talk a little bit about Leela, and in the text, in the introduction, you mention how entrance into the Leela is the highest goal for the bhakta in one of the traditions, at least. So I'm wondering what it means to have a practice that is entering into the Leela, for those that are not familiar with this path, and how does this differ from a goal of practice similar to the Yoga Sutras?
The goal of the Yoga Sutras is to realize one's own Atman. Drashtahu sva rupe vasthanam. That consciousness abides in its own nature, kevalya, autonomous. The Krishna traditions to which you're referring to accept that, and this plugs in again to the variegated nature of the Absolute. Those traditions would say the Absolute, that's one aspect of the Absolute, and that the one aspect of the Absolute is the myriad Atmans. There are unlimited Atmans, and each of those Atmans can have an experience of being absorbed in its own nature. And that's an experience of infinity and omnipresence. So it is a monistic experience, although they would say, and Patanjali would also seem to imply that there are multiple Atmans having that. They're not actually monistic in the Advaita sense, in the sense that Advaita would have them be. Now, the Krishna tradition would say that's fine, that's legitimate, and one can certainly attain that, and But they would say, but beyond the individual Atman, there is actually an Ishvara. There is a personal divine Godhead from whom the Atmans are manifestations. The Atmans are the amsas, the expansions, the expressions of that ultimate. So there is Ishvara, and that Ishvara has multiple forms, feminine and personal forms with qualities. When you have qualities, and we're talking about color and form and shape, and they're not made of Prakriti, they're not made of the same stuff as the things of this world, the earth, water, air, fire, and the Prakritic elements of this world. But they are pure Brahman, and sometimes it's called Sagun Brahman with qualities. So those forms include Shiva and Parvati, and it's not polytheism now, because polytheism is a very different thing. Polytheism is when you have multiple gods, and they're all more or less equal. Maybe, Thor is a bit tougher, or Zeus is a bit tougher, but basically they're ontological equals. So that's polytheism. This isn't that, although those gods are still there in Hinduism. We still have the lower level gods. But these are all forms which are poly but mono. They come from one source. Now, what that source is, of course, is a matter of sectarian debate. Is it personal? Is it impersonal? And amongst the personalists, those who say that that source is personal. Is it Vishnu that is the source of the other manifestations of Ishvara, or is it Shiva? So that becomes a sectarian thing. But let's just bracket that for now, because your question is about Leela. So once you have a theology which allows the existence of a distinct Godhead, right, and the Leela tends to be mostly associated. Leela means different things. In Kashmiri Shaivism, it means something different. But in the Krishna traditions, once your theology accommodates or allows the existence of a separate Ishvara, Krishna, then what's the relationship between the Atman and Ishvara? These are two distinct entities. Even Patanjali says that Ishvara is a Purusha Vishesha. Vishesha means distinct. That's what it means. A Visheshana is that which gives something a distinctive quality in Indian philosophy. So once you have a distinct Ishvara and an Atman, what's their relationship? So the Krishna tradition has this absolutely delightful vision of the kingdom of God, what a Christian might call the kingdom of God, where the Atman can have various kinds of relationships, and they enumerate 5 primary ones. The relationship of a lover and the beloved, like the gopis in the Vrindavan stories, the cowherd maidens. So you can have God as your lover. You can actually have a romantic, erotic, relationship with God. You're a very own form of Krishna. Krishna, it's not like there's one Krishna. Krishna can manifest unlimited Krishna forms, one for each of his devotees, the bhaktas. Or you can have a relationship as being, in the Christian tradition we think of God as Father, but in the Christian tradition, but in the Krishna tradition, it's more God as Son. So you can have God as your child. In other words, if that appeals to you, the idea of caring for God and so forth. So these are Leelas. These relationships are called Leelas. And then you can have God as friend, where you're equals, and the defining feature of the friendship. And these are called bhavs. You may have heard the word bhav. Bhav is the state of mind that accompanies that relationship. So the bhav of the third relationship, friendship, is you actually see God as your equal. Unaware of the majesty of God, that become covered by this type of maya, but a good kind of maya, called yoga maya. So now the Krishna theologies then say, that's all going on in the kingdom of God in Brahman. But in order to reveal this, Krishna, when he descends into the world in his incarnation, he comes and he sort of speaks the Gita, and he goes around and he kills various demons like so many avatars do. But specific to the Krishna incarnation, and this is what makes the 10th book of the Bhagavatam by far the most popular bhakti text ever, along with the Ramayana. The story of Krishna and the Ramayana, the two most popular around the Indian subcontinent. But what we find in the first half of that book is before Krishna, when he's still young, he hasn't grown up and goes out and fights the Mahabharata war, and he sort of stages the war, and zillions die, and kills all the demons, right? But before all of that, he's just a young child, and that's where the term Leela comes. And he engages in Leela, meaning playfulness, like he'll steal butter, and that way he gives joy to his mother. Those who have that parental bhav. A certain type of bhav means a mindset. Now, I don't know if, obviously, so much more can be said about that, and we only have limitations of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was wonderful. And so I guess one question that arose for me that I'm curious if this is sort of the right direction to take it is Leela an invitation to see the sacred in all the relationships in your life? Is that a misinterpretation of that, or is that kind of somewhat the spirit of it?
Well, that would be the spirit more of Kashmiri Shaivism, where they use the term Leela a little bit differently. And then, of course, Shiva is the whole creation is a Leela, and they would maybe sort of agree they would maybe sort of orient themselves to that interpretation. Mm-hmm. But in the Krishna tradition, Leela is something very specific to Krishna.
Okay.
It is your relationship with Krishna, and the bhakta is aspiring, is meditating on Krishna all the time. That's what it makes it bhakti.
Okay.
In jnana, you're meditating on the Atman all the time. That's what it
So in other
It's
words,
jnana.
not everything in my life is Krishna.
No.
Okay.
Well, it is on one sort of level, in the sense that everything is Krishna because Prakriti is Krishna. Like the sunlight is the sun, so the sunlight pervades everything, even though the sun is in the sky. So God pervades everything, even though God is also transcendent. So God is immanent in everything. Sure. But when Krishna Bhaktas use the term Leela, they're using it very specifically to what they aspire for, which is an eternal, specific kind of relationship with God for all eternity, post-mortem.
I see.
If they can, if they're able to arrive at that in this life, if their practice, qualifies them in this life, if their mind is completely and utterly absorbed in devotion 100%, if they manage that in this life. If not, it may take 2 or 3 or 10 lives. But the ultimate goal is for the mind to be so utterly absorbed in thoughts of God. And once it starts to become completely